Today's stories do contain some disturbing subject matter, and viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a story you would like to send my way, just go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And as always, thank you. And Happy Easter. This happened a few years back, when I was visiting with my family for Easter. I was living on my own at this point, but since my grandmother's birthday was in April, and we typically did a small Easter and birthday get-together with my parents and siblings. This year I was bringing along my girlfriend, who I had been with for almost a year, so that she could meet some of my family, so I was pretty excited about that, and thankfully she was too. My grandparents lived in a quiet little neighborhood that was basically like a retirement community. They lived in what was essentially condos, because they were connected, but they were also more house-like, more so than an apartment. They had their own buildings and even backyards and patios. It was a pretty nice area, and their neighbors were your fairly typical retired people. They left you alone for the most part, but would always make sure to greet anyone they saw coming or going. I had been there and stayed overnight a few times when I was younger, so I had fond memories of the place. So we went over there on Sunday afternoon. It was about an hour's drive for us, and we got there a little earlier than anticipated. My parents were already there, so I introduced them and my grandparents to my girlfriend, Whitney, and we all just sat around and talked for a bit. And shortly after, my siblings started to show up one by one. My younger sister and older brother both had a kid, so my grandparents were pretty excited about hiding eggs for them. After the egg hunt, we had dinner about an hour or two later, and then we all just kicked back while the kids dug into their Easter baskets. At one point, my grandpa, my dad, and I were sitting in the living room talking while the rest of the family was scattered about. My dad was mid-sentence when we heard what sounded like someone softly tapping on the door. It stopped my dad as we listened to see if there was maybe one of the kids playing around, when the knocking happened again. So, my dad got up and went to the front door to see who it could be. Yet when he opened the door, there was no one there. So we went back to our original thought of it was probably someone messing around, and continued our conversation. Shortly after, the tapping happened again, so my dad shouted towards the kitchen and asked where the kids were. My mom responded that they were out back with my sister and Whitney playing, so my dad got up and walked into the kitchen and continued their conversation. My grandpa and I sat there silently for a moment, until Whitney walked back into the room and asked me what that knocking sound was. It caught me off guard at first because I asked her what she meant, and after she explained the same 5-knock pattern that happened twice, which was similar to what we heard. However, what we heard was a quieter tapping sound. What she actually heard startled her and my sister, as it sounded like a very loud banging. The condo was decent sized, but it definitely wasn't big, so if there was a loud banging, we should have heard it too. After talking to a few others there, my mom and grandma in the kitchen said they didn't hear anything. My brother, who was in the bathroom, didn't hear anything either, nor did my brother-in-law, who was out front smoking. My sister and Whitney heard a loud banging out back, and the other 3 of us in the living room just heard a tapping. It was odd to us that those of us that did hear something was so vastly different. Yet those in the kitchen, who were in between the living room and the back door, heard nothing. With no explanation, we just continued with our night, shrugging it off as something that was just weird. As it started getting a bit dark, everyone came back inside, but we had the screen back door open because it felt nice out. As we were all talking between the living room and kitchen table, we then heard another knocking. This time, everyone looked towards the door, telling me that everybody heard it, My grandpa made a joke about my sister-in-law being late to the party, and we all chuckled as he walked to the door. Yet again, when he opened the door, there was nobody there. He walked out front looking around and then came back in with the look of confusion. There was no one out there. We all had heard it clear as day, but my grandma tried to make light of the situation, saying that someone must just be playing a prank. My dad didn't like that idea, though, and said that he wanted to walk around to see if he could spot someone. My brother-in-law agreed to go with him, and they shut the door behind them. Shortly after they left, as we were starting back up the conversation, we were all startled by a blood-curdling scream. It sounded like a woman screaming for her life. I think we all pretty much jumped up when we heard it and looked at each other to make sure everyone was okay. This then caused my brother to head for the door, and I followed closely behind him. I was worried that something had happened outside, or maybe my dad and brother-in-law found something or someone. As we walked out, I didn't see anyone in the front yard, and the street was seemingly clear, other than a few parked cars on the side. That's when we heard it again, a very loud and piercing scream, but I couldn't pinpoint a direction that it was coming from. I called out for my dad with panic in my voice when I saw him and my brother-in-law approach the front yard from the privacy gate that separated the front from the back. He ran up to me and my brother and asked if we were okay and what had happened. We then explained to them that we had just heard the scream and wanted to make sure they were okay. They pretty much told us the same story. However, they said that they only heard one scream, and that was the second one. How the hell could they have not heard the first one when it was clear to us in the house? They said that they walked around the entire condo and didn't see anything. They told me to go back inside and call the cops, while the other three continued to walk around. I ran back inside and grabbed my phone to call the police with trembling hands. I remember trying to stay calm as I looked over to Whitney and the rest of my family to tell them that I was just calling as a precaution. It felt like hours before the police finally showed up, but it hadn't really been that long. My dad and brother-in-law greeted them in the driveway and explained what had happened. There were two that came, and they actually called for a few more so that they could check the surrounding area. They had us all stay inside, but my brother-in-law didn't really leave the front stoop. So, this is where things went from terrifying to bizarre. They came back and asked us all specifically what we heard, when we heard it, and from what direction did it sound like it had come from. We all described the exact same thing, except when it came down to where it sounded like it had come from. My dad and brother-in-law claimed that they never heard the first scream, but the second one sounded like it was coming from the front. While we were inside, those that were at the kitchen table, closer to the open back door, said that it sounded louder from back there. If so, it makes even less sense how they hadn't heard it. But for me, I could not pinpoint a direction. Both times it sounded like it was right in front of me. Like I had my eyes closed, and if I were to open them, I would see who the screams were coming from. The cops were trying to pinpoint a direction, but we really weren't that much help, so they said they were going to ask some of the neighbors because clearly they would have heard this too. But they came back shortly after and said that the about dozen or so other homes they knocked on claimed that they did not hear anything. Not a peep. They also said that they didn't have anyone tapping or knocking on windows or doors either. I think if it weren't for all of us having such a similar story, they would have probably thought that we were lying. So they looked around a bit more and even drove by a few nearby streets, but when they found nothing, they said that they would have to leave. They then told us to call back if it happened again, or if we spot anything suspicious. After they left, we were all dumbfounded by the situation, and had lost any kind of party mood. We all started dispersing and going home. My mom later informed me that they ended up staying the night there, because after we had all left, They started hearing what sounded like someone pounding on a window in one of the rooms. But once again, there was no trace of anybody. The grass hadn't been pulled down near the windows. There were no marks or smudges on them. My grandma was getting worried and my dad didn't want to leave them alone, so they stayed. However, that was the last event that they'd had for the night. Thankfully, I guess. We all kept an eye on the news for a while, wondering if there was going to be a report on someone who was injured, killed, or kidnapped in the area, but nothing ever came of it. My grandmother even went and talked to some of the neighbors herself, and they all told her the same thing. They had never heard anything. It was definitely a freaky situation, but it was the only thing that ever happened in the area. It was, however, enough to spook my grandma enough to want to move, which they did a year after that. We still to this day have no explanation for the screaming or the knocking, but I just hope that there wasn't someone really out there in distress. And honestly, it's something that sticks with me to this day. Before going into anything, I have to say this. I do not affiliate to any religion or cult. My belief is that all life is to be respected and that all life forms possess an energy that one should be considerate of. 2 years ago, my boyfriend and I decided to go camping on Easter morning. The weather was unusually warm and sunny, so why not spend it outdoors? We packed our stuff, got the dogs in the car, and set to the road. It was very spontaneous, so we didn't really plan where we would set up camp. Just a general direction in a national park. We're in Europe. The forest was breathtaking. We drove up a dirt road along a small river for about an hour. It was a rough ride and we couldn't find any spots, as on our left was a rock wall and on the right a river valley. To this day, I say the place presented itself to us. I was frustrated that we were wasting light and demanded that we stop at the next turn. We got out to stretch our legs, took the dogs, and noticed they kept going down to the river. We followed them and found the most beautiful clearing under a riverbank, right at a shallow bend of the river. We had a clear view up and down the river, but otherwise you would have no idea we were there. It was hidden away from the road. It felt like home. We found an old stone hearth, which made a beech sapling grow on it. I replanted the sapling somewhere safe before making the fire. My grandfather taught me from a young age to respect the forest. Before the meal, I made a small gift to the forest with some tea. It just felt right. The day passed nicely, and as the sun went down, it got cold very fast. At some point, we put out the fire and got into the tent for warmth. The one thing that will always stay with me from this outing is the pure darkness. It was so dark that I had to check with my fingers if my eyes were closed or not. I had never experienced anything like that, and I hope that I don't anytime soon. It was deeply unsettling. During the night, I could barely sleep. The sound of the river was incessant yet low, like a constant buzz. What kept me awake, though, were the strange sounds around the tent. I understand that nature is weird and has a lot of weird sounds. More than once, I heard something brushing on the tent, like someone would trace their hand down on it. Top to bottom, on the left, then on the right, and then behind, all over it. I just played it off as leaves or bugs falling from the trees. The next part is what really freaked me out. I started hearing muffled voices, sometimes paired with the brushing, other times on their own. There were a few voices, all obnoxiously happy. I could hear loud laughter, singing, people talking loudly. I couldn't understand a word, but their happiness felt off, menacing at times. At the same time, I felt like I was being watched. like something was towering over us and counting my breaths. I felt the need to cower and hide. I barely moved all night. This kept going the whole night. Close to the morning, it seemed to quiet down, and I was able to sleep for an hour. I woke up at the first light, and I was so relieved that it was day again. I felt it in my bones. I felt as if a pressure had been lifted. I just felt liberated. At that point, I didn't mention anything to my boyfriend about the voices. I wasn't concerned that he would call me crazy, but I felt the urge to just shut up. Like I shouldn't speak about it there. The rest of the morning went by quietly. Just before getting the last bags, I stopped just near the clearing and said, "Thank you for having us," to the forest. It felt like the right thing to do. Not a second after, a bird started singing in front of us, like it was answering me. I whistled back and it sang back to me. I kept this going for a few more times. By the time we were loading in the car, the canopy above us was full of singing birds. It did not feel natural in any way. Those birds were huddled around us, like sending us off. It felt like a goodbye. I can't put it into words, but I felt so melancholic, hurt, even. For a moment, I felt like I was leaving home, not for home. Once we left the woods behind, both of us relaxed. I wasn't even aware that I was so tensed. I asked my boyfriend how he felt about the experience, and he said that he heard the brushing too, and a few voices once or twice. He confessed that he too felt very uneasy during the night, and that the bird thing was very peculiar. I don't know what all these things were, but I know that I felt a presence with us the whole time. I felt watched. I tried to reason it out, but somehow even the memories about it feel off. So, this is something that happened to me when I was much younger. I recently watched a YouTube video that reminded me of this, and I wanted to share it with you. Back whenever I was about 8 or 9, I believe, I went to an Easter egg hunt with my family at our local church. Now, at the time, we lived in the middle of nowhere within the Midwest, and the state or county had recently started projects to expand the area. It was mostly just open acreage, but wasn't even being used for agriculture. So, I guess they just saw a lot of opportunity. Signs and fencing started going up all over where they were going to be building an apartment complex, some sort of strip mall, another grocery store, and even planned on expanding some of the roads. I was a kid, so I didn't really understand all of it. I just remember my dad not being too keen on the idea, and my mom was constantly being optimistic about it. I just thought it was cool, because our teacher mentioned that we could be getting a new school eventually. Sorry for the run-on there, but it is a little relevant to my story. And we attended the same church for as long as I could remember. And every year, they held an Easter egg hunt as well as their normal Easter service. On this year, with one of the apartment complexes being completed and applications being accepted, the church wanted to do something bigger, to hopefully attract more attendees. They had signs everywhere, and kept mentioning that the egg hunt was going to be huge. And it was. I remember my family, which consisted of my parents, myself, and my little sister all being there. I had an older brother, but he was too old to do the egg hunt, so he was with his friends from church at the time. We all went to the yard behind the church to prepare for the hunt. The yard out back was huge. There were trees scattered within the flat grassy area, and then further back was another line of trees. I think that there was a walking path back there, but I also never went, so I wasn't sure at the time. They hid the eggs all over the place. Within the yard, in the grass, in the bushes, in crevices of trees and branches. There was a small side parking lot that was blocked off because they had a few booths over there for games and food, and there were even some eggs hidden over there too. Us kids had free reign of the area to hunt them, but were told to try to leave the ones just sitting in the grass for the very young kids, which was fine. I was very competitive at things like this, and maybe even candy motivated. They weren't all candy though. Some had small trinkets in them, coins or small bills, and some had Bible verses. So, since they weren't all candy, that meant that I wanted to get even more, to increase the chances of the candy that I got. Anyways, as the egg hunt began, my parents told me that I could go wherever I wanted, while they held back to help my little sister. So, I immediately went by the parking lot and got a lot over there. I even grabbed a few that I found from the trees. I liked to climb the tree in our front yard, so it wasn't hard for me to do the same to get the eggs. Now, because I was looking at my bag quickly filling up, it motivated me even more to continue, and I thought of the genius idea to check all of the trees. I climbed up several of them, and I found even more. This led me further away from the main group and closer to the forest of trees in the far back, and before I realized it, I had made my way in to those trees. After searching a few more and no longer finding any eggs, I decided that I probably went too deep and that I should leave. However, as I looked around, I couldn't figure out which way I had come from. Which way was the way out and which way was getting deeper. And even worse, I didn't see a path anywhere like I was expecting. I thought maybe I could remember a tree that stood out to me, one with some kind of memorable markings or anything, yet I found nothing. I continued to walk aimlessly, but it was getting me nowhere. Being so young, the only thing I had left to do was scream out and cry. I fell to the ground and sobbed for a bit, thinking of all the different things that could possibly happen. At the time, I didn't think about just continuing to walk in one direction until I found an exit. I just assumed that I would get deeper into the woods and get even more lost. As I sat there, I opened one of my eggs and I ate a piece of candy. While I did this, I heard a crunch from the ground and looked up. Near a tree that was a few feet ahead of me, there was a woman standing there and looking at me. Seeing a random person in the woods with me startled me at first, but the lady herself wasn't scary at all, nor did she throw off any red flags. In fact, I remembered thinking that she looked like she was straight out of a fairy tale. She was wearing a wispy dress, it's the only way that I know how to explain it, as well as a fluffy and patchy knit jacket. She had long braided copper-colored hair that also looked frazzled towards the top. She had a brown burlap bag strapped to her back, and was also carrying another bag by hand. Her face looked kind and concerned, though. After my initial jump, I asked who she was, and she just asked, "Are you lost? You shouldn't be in here by yourself. But you know that already, don't you?" I confirmed that I was indeed lost and explained how the Easter egg hunt had distracted me. She slowly approached and said that she wasn't going to hurt me, and began to dig around in one of her bags. Then she sat down across from me and handed me something wrapped in paper. I stared at it for a moment, and she told me that it was a sandwich and that I could have it, as a way to prove that she was nice. Again, a few things here. I was 9 years old. I guess you could say that I wasn't really talked to about stranger danger due to the small town that we lived in, and that everybody knew everyone else. I guess they didn't really find it was necessary. I'm not sure of their reasoning, but this is me, explaining my next actions. Also, I had breakfast that morning and we wouldn't be eating until later for our Easter dinner. Combine that with running around and climbing trees, yeah, I was pretty hungry. I unwrapped the sandwich and took it apart to see that it was just bologna and cheese and mayonnaise. I didn't like mayonnaise though, so I scraped it off the best that I could and just ate it with one slice of bread. As I ate it, she just watched me with her chin resting on her hands. As I finished it, she started asking me about things such as my name, my age, if I had any siblings, where I went to school, just simple things. As I answered her, I started feeling more and more relaxed and calm. I don't feel like it lasted very long, but after some talking, I asked who she was and if she was lost too. She just smiled and said, "Oh, I'm just lucky." I remember at the time thinking that must be her name, partially because we used to have a dog named Lucky, and I told her this. This made her laugh, and she seemed happy to hear me talk about Lucky. Shortly after, she then told me that my parents were probably worried about me, and that I should go. I agreed, but then made a comment about not knowing how to get out. She gave me another one of her soft smiles, took my hand, and said that she would help me, and started leading me in one direction. We came up to a tree that had a lot of vines wrapping around it, and she stopped. She told me to keep walking in the direction that we were, and to not turn whatsoever, and to not look back. She then said I would find my way out before I could count to 100. At my age, I thought that that was an odd thing to say, but I just smiled, bragged about my counting skills, and began walking. It wasn't long after that that I found a break in the trees, and I could hear a few people shouting my name. But right before I continued walking, I heard the lady clearly say, "Goodbye, Chase." And since I wasn't good at following directions, I looked back. But the lady was gone. However, one of the reasons I looked back was because of what she had said. My name is Alexander, and I had told her that earlier. But I hate the nickname Alex, so a lot of people call me by my middle name, which was Chase. If anything, I would have expected this lady to call me Alexander or maybe Alex, but not Chase. How would she have known that? And perplexed, I continued through the trees and nearly fell over a small ledge of dirt. I saw a few people that I recognized standing around and several people shouting my name, including my mother. She sounded frightened, so I shouted back for her and everyone turned to look at me. My mom ran over to me and asked where I had been, and I just told her that I got lost in the woods. She quickly disciplined me for going in there, but then just asked if I was hurt or anything. I shook my head and told her about the lady that had helped me out. She looked at me confused and looked back towards the trees, but then just picked me up and brought me back over towards the church. The thing I hadn't realized at the time was that it had been several hours since I went into those woods. It certainly didn't feel like I was gone that long, but that's why everyone was so concerned. They were about to call 911. Later that night, I tried to explain to my parents what had happened, and I described the lady that helped me. I remember the look on their face was one of disbelief at the time, probably thinking that I exaggerated some details, but it was all real. Every detail I remember about her was so vivid that I have not forgotten. I've been in those woods since I've gotten older, both alone and with my older brother, but I've never seen that woman again. I've even talked to other people that have gone into those woods, and they said they've never experienced anything like this before. However, since that experience, every time I've gone in there, I've had this strong sense of peace and felt safe. Like there's someone that is always watching over me. Easter is not a religious holiday for my family. My family just tend to give each other a chocolate egg and hang around the house doing nothing to celebrate it, especially as the younger kids got older and became teenagers. and I was included in that group. There was one Easter event that we used to do that was stopped after this incident occurred. The adults in the family would wake up really early, or stay up really late drinking depending on the night, and hide Easter eggs around the garden. We would all get tiny baskets to carry and to stash our eggs. My family would go all out. Occasionally, we would invite cousins or friends over to take part in the events, and I loved it. They would be tiny eggs, big eggs, and it was the envy of all the local kids. I also need to add that I don't have a small backyard by any means. I live on a 1/4 of an acre block, and yes, the Easter egg hunt took place on it, so we were out there for a long time. That, and there were a lot of trees and shrubs to hide in. This is important for later on. Like the rest of the kids, I grabbed my basket and sped off in the hunt of sweet, sweet chocolate. I may have pushed past my younger brothers, and I'm not the first to deny it is survival of the fittest when it comes to getting the chocolate goodness. At the end of the driveway was a boring-looking man holding a bunch of Easter eggs. He was hiding behind one of the trees, talking to himself and just laughing. I'd love to say that there was something really off about him, but he just looked so average. Almost non-threatening. He didn't notice me at first. I was going to call out for the adults in the family that someone had stolen our eggs. When he did notice me, he told me that he had even more chocolate like this in his car. And I know that my reaction is weird, but I laughed. This was one of those weird style of pranks that members of my family would play on each other. I know, we all have a pretty sick sense of humor. He actually looked angry that I laughed at him, and that only made it more funny. Again, we have strange senses of humor. He told me to hurry up and come with him. I told him no, and to give me back all the chocolate that he stole. He argued with me, and he was getting really mad. Like, he had somewhere to be in a hurry, and he wanted me to come along with him. Not a chance. Some of the younger kids heard what was happening and came to see what the fuss was all about. It was only when he asked them and tried to grab one of their arms that I knew that something was up. I screamed and made as much noise as possible. He tried to tell me to shut up, he offered me money, and then he threatened me and tried to drag me away by the arm. I struggled to get away, and he actually left marks on my arm. The rest of the family did manage to chase him off. Fortunately, no one got seriously hurt. Now, the outcome of what happened. The police never found the guy. They took statements and the community was warned about him. I have no idea who he was, and I haven't seen him since that day. Rumor around town was that he was someone that was caught once torturing small animals, and that he was now moving on to human prey. There were also rumors that he was seen stealing random items off of clothing lines and trying to spy on women while they changed. Typical small-town gossip that may or may not have been true. Either way, no one saw him again. The unfortunate outcome is that now we don't do the Easter egg hunt and we're just given our chocolate eggs. I do miss how it used to be, how it was something fun that we all did, and I hate how one creep managed to change something so special. I hate how it ruined a family tradition for us, but better that than one of the kids getting grabbed. I worry about what could have happened if one of the more gullible kids had come up, and I dread to think of what that absolute creep's intentions were. The last thing that I remember from it is seeing a bunch of chocolate eggs all stomped on and mashed up into the grass. I don't really like to eat the chocolate anymore. So that, my friends, was a collection of 4 creepy Easter stories, or stories that involved or mentioned Easter, I suppose. Stories where Easter was a subject somewhere in the story, and yeah. Definitely some creepy ones. Most of these were actually paranormal or supernatural, I suppose, if you want to call them that. they weren't of the normal creepy person variety. Well, one was, but the other ones weren't. That's kind of a bizarre thing to happen. That usually does not occur on these kinds of stories, and that's neat. I like it. Thankfully, there were no creepy bunny men walking around this year. Maybe next year. Maybe next year. Maybe I'll make it happen. Anyways, I hope you all are having a beautiful weekend. I hope you're having a great day and hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. I would appreciate it. You can also leave me a comment down below letting me know your thoughts, how you're doing, how your weekend's going. If you have any plans on Easter, which is tomorrow, I believe. Well, tomorrow or Monday, I guess. The calendar's kind of confusing with Easter. I always thought it was Sunday, but then I keep reading that it's Easter Monday, not Sunday. I don't know. I don't know. Anyways, hopefully y'all enjoyed it. If you did, yeah, all that stuff. If you can or want to, you can also do a super thanks, join memberships, or Patreon, with early access, stuff like that. Never expected, always appreciated. You know the deal. Yeah. All that said, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. A little bit of sinus issues today, if you guys haven't noticed. The weather here has been insane. So it's really, it's kicking my butt. Yeah, but I'll be okay. Yeah. I hope I do see you all again soon. I really do. But until it happens, my friend, remember you are loved, you are valid, you are important, you are the best you that you can be. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. And never forget it. And until I see you again, my friend, much love. And sleep well.